Hi, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Fake News. I'm your host, Candice Malcolm, founder of True North and a columnist over at the Toronto Sun and with Post Media. Welcome to another episode. This is a show where I go through and point out some of the most biased news stories of the week in Canada, unpack a little bit, and talk about just general trends in biased news and fake news reporting in Canada. So thanks so much for tuning in. Again, if you like this video and you like what we're working on here, please like the video, share it, help us distribute it to reach more and more Canadians. So with that, let's jump right into a few of the top stories that I chose this week. You know, it's really interesting because we are gearing up for the federal election here in Canada, kind of getting more and more stories related to the election. And, you know, if you just followed the mainstream media and listened to the reports that they put out, you would really start to get the picture that the two main issues facing Canadians, the two most important things in Canada facing Canadians in this election cycle, are feminism, the state of feminism in Canada, and global warming, the state of sort of alarmism when it comes to climate change and with global warming. That's what the media want you to think. So many journalists who lean left in Canada, who are themselves activists and left-wing advocates, want you to believe that feminism and global warming are the two top most important issues. In Canada, I would argue that they are not even in the top 10. But as you have it, you see more and more of these stories popping up. So the first one I want to point your attention to is this story put out by Canadian Press. Here it is in the Huffington Post, but Canadian Press is a wire service, so this story will appear in newspapers across Canada. The headline: what role will feminism play in the federal election? And the story basically starts off by just highlighting Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau received a lot of attention with his line about the calendar year when asked why he named an equal number of men and women to cabinet after his newly elected government was sworn in. That was back in 2015. Now, of course, that was an idiotic response. There was a question, you know, why did you choose to base your cabinet not on the people's skills, not on the top qualities, the top candidates, not based on people's career and their service and their work, but you chose to appoint your cabinet, some of the highest ranking positions in Canada, based purely on gender. And of course, Trudeau didn't have a good answer. He didn't have a good reason as to why he disproportionately chose women. Remember, only 26% of MPs are women, and yet 50% of his cabinet were men. So he appointed twice as many women into position of power as there were women in cabinet. He didn't have a good answer, so he just said, because it's 2015, which I guess that was impressive to some people. Some people on the left and people in the media swooned over that. But, you know, to people who actually wanted to know why he chose to do that, it was completely a ridiculous answer. It didn't provide any insight into his decision making other than just that he didn't really think much about it. It's 2015, that's why I did it. So according to this story, that was a brilliant answer, and Trudeau received a lot of attention for it. And then, you know, the story kind of goes on to list some of the Liberals' things that they've done to push for so-called gender equality in government. And then we hear from an expert on feminist policies saying, you know, the problem with pushing for feminism is that there's two camps of people. One camp who don't want to see that kind of stuff. They don't want, you know, positions being chosen based on feminism. And then there are other people who are the feminists themselves who always say that not enough is being done. That's actually pretty accurate observation there. I would probably agree with that. You know, interestingly, the story goes on to quote someone from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. The story doesn't mention, but that is a far left organization. It's a left-wing organization which is not in this story. You know, if you're going to name an organization, as they usually do when they say, you know, the Fraser Institute, they'll usually mention that it's a conservative organization or a free market organization, more like a classical liberal organization in the traditional definition of the word. Anyway, leaving out the fact that this is a left-wing organization is a little shady. So far we have talked to two people in this story, and they both offer a left-wing perspective. You know, this woman's going on to applaud the Trudeau government for a bunch of stuff. And then they talk to a third person who is a chief executive of a polling firm who talks about sort of you know, what the Conservatives have done, what the NDP have done, and what the Liberals have done for so-called feminism or to advance feminism. Interestingly, though, this entire story goes through, interviews several people, goes through a whole bunch of the different policies of the parties, and kind of applauds the Trudeau government for their so-called feminism. But interestingly, they don't mention any of the problems that Trudeau has had with his feminist shtick. I mean, most people would accuse Justin Trudeau of being a fake feminist. I've written columns about that so much of his, talk about feminism is just empty rhetoric, complete virtue signaling. What about the fact that he's been accused of groping a young reporter at a music festival when he was in his 20s? And then he said that he would have never done it if he had known she was reporting for a national newspaper. That's sexual harassment, what he's been accused of doing there. You think that that might be worthy of just mentioning in the story that he's been accused of sexual harassment, and he actually admitted to it back in 2000 and apologized. So there's something like an admission of guilt. Wouldn't that be sort of something that you might want to mention in the story? Or how about the fact that two of his high-ranking, strong women in his cabinet were removed and are no longer there? There's no mention in this story whatsoever of the whole Judy Wilson-Raybould affair and the fact that Jane Philpott left. The fact that two strong women were pushed out of the Liberal caucus, pushed out of cabinet for standing up to the Prime Minister. I mean, what does that show about the character of this Prime Minister? And we're supposed to just read this article, believe that he's a feminist, and just take that as face value? I mean, really not mentioning those two pieces of information, which I think are key when thinking about Trudeau and his policy towards women and whether or not he actually is a feminist. Missing those points, I think, again, is pretty dishonest if we're going to be having a conversation about feminism. Now, of course, the idea that somehow feminism needs to be a top issue and story in this election, that there'll be Canadian voters who are actually voting based on who's the biggest feminist of the political parties, is total nonsense. I mean, if you look at the Canadian government as it is, it's already ridiculous in how much it overemphasizes the need to help women. There's an entire department dedicated to the status of women, which I find to be completely condescending. The fact that there needs to be a special government department just to make sure that somehow women are being treated properly. It assumes that women are inferior, that we need special government programs and special government help just to make sure that we're treated fairly and equally. I find that completely paternalistic and condescending towards women. I think that department should be completely done away with. And one thing that I will mention that I like, I hadn't talked about this before, but the Conservatives this summer made a pledge to introduce non-refundable tax credits to new mothers and fathers. So when you're in maternity leave or parental leave, you get benefits from the government. Currently they're taxable, so the Conservatives will make those non-taxable, which is helpful. As a new parent myself, as a new mom myself, I think that every dollar helps. And so the idea that you wouldn't be having to pay taxes on those benefits is definitely something that can help a lot of moms and dads out there. The New Democrats have also released something about what they would like to do for women. This year, once again, they are promising universal, affordable, nonprofit health care right across the country, child care across the country. So the NDP wants to set up government-run daycares, which I would not be for. Just personally, I would never put my child into government daycare, and it doesn't really work for a lot of Canadians. It only really works if you live in a big city where there is a childcare facility nearby and that you happen to work like regular 9 to 5 hours. So it really only helps people who live in big cities and people who work office jobs, 9 to 5 jobs, which I imagine that many mothers out there across Canada and fathers don't fit into that mold. So it's kind of like a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't really work for a lot of parents, whereas the Conservative plan here would help everyone, because everyone gets those tax-free benefits, which just puts more money into the pockets of mom and dad. So There's another story here. I'll just quickly go through on Radio Canada, which is the French CBC, and again, it says why set up to fail, why women still don't win elections as often as men do in Canada, and then they just have a whole bunch of sort of people analyzing and trying to figure out what it is. Of course, the reason for this is just simply that the women who go into politics might not have the same kind of electability as the men. It's almost like random. It just depends on what women are running, what men are running, what riding they're in. I think that just looking at it as a whole and saying that men do better in elections than women is just missing so much of the picture, and it's like watering people down to just one characteristic. I'm a woman. Nothing else about me matters. My experience, my background, my ability to speak publicly, to talk about public policy issues, my electability, my likability, all these things are ignored, and it's just boiled down to man, woman, which is just really silly and nonsensical. All right, let's move on to the next issue here. Again, like I said, the Canadian media want voters to believe that the two most important issues in this election are feminism and climate change. So here's another story in the Canadian press here. It's in the HuffPo again, but the story, it's a wire service story, so it's going to appear in newspapers all over Canada. And here's the headline here: Canadian voters must treat climate change as if it's a war, leading activists say. Okay, here we go. So we have David Suzuki and Stephen Lewis, who are planning to do campaign events across Canada during the election this year. And they are trying to raise the alarm bell, ring the alarm bell, get people nervous, create this sort of urgency, saying that Canada needs to confront climate change, and they need to treat the situation as if Canada were at war against greenhouse gases. Now, just right off the top, I find this story super ironic because keep in mind that it's left-wing advocates. It's people like David Suzuki and Stephen Lewis. It's people like NDP members who are always against war. They always lead the anti-war efforts. They were against the war in Iraq. They were against even the bombing of ISIS. NDP was advocating that the Conservatives at the time withdraw its bombing campaign against ISIS. So they don't even want us to go to war against a group as horrendous as ISIS, and yet now they want us to pretend that we are at war against greenhouse gases. So when Canada's in a real war, they don't like it, but then they want to create this like fictitious fake war against greenhouse gases and against basically our own society. And we're supposed to get all excited about that. So I don't know, the story is just sort of nonsense about how they are, they want to treat Canada. Basically, they want us to pretend that we're at war against ourselves, because really greenhouse gases are a outcome of our civilization, of our industry, of our resources. And every time you do anything, from using your smartphone to getting in your car to turning on your lights, everything we do is powered by greenhouse gases. So for us to go to war against our own actions in order to basically just scare everybody, to have everybody just afraid that the world is going to end if we don't completely change our lifestyle, that's the agenda of these far left activists, and the mainstream media is legitimizing it, treating it not like it's something that we should be skeptical of or something that's very absurd. There's not a lot of skeptical reaction in this piece. It's just talking about how it's a legitimate effort, a legitimate campaign effort, and we should take it seriously, according to the Canadian press. Really, I think that voters should be a lot more skeptical of this kind of stuff when you have alarmist people who want us to pretend that we're at war against ourselves. We should be very skeptical. These kind of alarmists, by the way, are often wrong. And actually, there's a story this week that was completely ignored by the mainstream media, not surprisingly. But here it is. Climate scientists admit their models are wrong. This kind of stuff happens every now and then, where you have a big UN report come out talking about how we need to be urgent, talking about weather models, how global warming is worse than ever, and that gets a lot of press, it gets a lot of media attention, and then like a couple weeks or months later, they'll kind of quietly put out another report saying that, oops, we were wrong, our numbers were wrong, the modeling was wrong, and it's not quite as bad as we said. That second news piece never really gets the same attention as the original report, and it looks like that's what's happened again here. So we have some climate scientists who authored a peer-reviewed paper that acknowledged that their climate models were wrong. And of course, the climate models over-exaggerated the temperature changes and the trends. Again, this happens with some frequency, and the media never quite covers it with the same furiousness as they do the initial reports. And so if we were to just leave it to the media, leave it to people like David Suzuki, they want us to believe that our planet is going to be gone, that the world is going to end in like 11 years if we don't act now. It's complete, alarmism, and we should treat it with a lot more skepticism. And, contrary to what the media are saying, feminism and global warming are not the two most important issues in Canada right now. I would say they're not. Again, not even the top 10. You have issues like, I think, taxes and pocketbook issues are the major issues that Canadians are worried about right now. Immigration and illegal immigration, the huge spike in asylum seekers, the number of illegal immigrants in Canada, that's a huge issue I'm hearing. A lot of people talk about the economy in general, Canadian unity, and as well as government ethics, the ethics of the Prime Minister and his actions and the actions of several high-ranking officials in the government. Those are the core issues that Canadians are going to be voting on. And this idea that they're pushing in the mainstream media that it's really feminism and climate change, I just think that misses the boat, and it is wrong. So let's move on. Just one final story I want to talk about quickly here. There were reports, everyone's sort of talking about this on social media right now. There were reports in an Arab newspaper earlier this week that said that Canada was going to take 100,000 Palestinians as part of a peace deal that's being negotiated right now in the Middle East. The report said that Canada would receive 100,000 Palestinians from Lebanon and Syria, and that Spain would be taking 16,000 Palestinians from Lebanon. And the story was picked up by the Jerusalem Post, which is a very reputable news source in Israel. And basically it was quoting Palestinian sources, so people within Palestinian factions, so like leaders and officials within Palestinian faction, claiming that this was the case. Now, the Canadian government and Justin Trudeau very quickly dismissed it and said it was disinformation, it was not true, not accurate. This Jerusalem Post story has an update quoting a Canadian official, basically just saying that it's important that people rely on accurate information before starting their journey. There's no special programs currently being considered to resettle people from Lebanon or Syria. So the government of Canada is completely denying this, while reports from the Middle East are saying that this is the case. It's all part of a big peace deal that's being negotiated right now, led by Donald Trump. Trump is calling it the deal of the century. And we're supposed to hear more about it later this month. It's really interesting. The government was really quick to jump all over this. There's a lot of people on social media saying anyone that was posting this was pushing fake news. Again, the Jerusalem Post is a very reputable source, and you have to wonder, what is the origin of this story? Why is it that Palestinian leaders are saying this to be true, and the Canadians are denying it? You have to wonder, what kind of conversations are going on behind closed doors. Remember, the last Liberal Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, went to Israel to be part of these peace talks, and he kind of spontaneously announced that Canada was going to be taking 15,000 Palestinian refugees at the time, and that had not been previously announced or discussed at all. So these things sort of tend to just come out, quickly. But the Canadians are very much denying that this is the case. I do applaud the Canadian government for kind of, clarifying the issue right away and trying to correct false stories, because, sometimes people, for instance, if you're a Palestinian living in Lebanon or Syria and you see the report, you might get the idea that, hey, I should just go to Canada. I should just get on a plane and go, and they're going to accept me. So it's good that the Canadian government is dispelling the rumor, but you have to say, you have to look at why these kind of misinformation stories get generated in the first place. Is someone speaking out of turn, or is it just sort of the general, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is known for being very welcoming of refugees. That's part of his image. That's who he's built himself to be. Look at his tweets from January 2017 telling persecuted people to come to Canada, saying Canada would welcome them. Or another tweet that was put out a couple months later by the Prime Minister basically saying anyone and everyone was welcome to come to Canada, which is not true. Canada has very strict immigration rules and a very stringent review process before anyone is allowed to come. So the perception that gets pushed around in these rumors and these hoaxes that get spread that people should come to Canada, they do have an origin. I would argue that the origin in this case comes from the Prime Minister's own image and his own insistence on putting these messages out and really making it unclear as to what Canada's actual immigration policy is. Remember, after that infamous tweet that he put out in January 2017, there were legitimate news stories all over the world that actually thought that Canada had a policy of accepting refugees. People thought that Trudeau was announcing some kind of a policy change that anyone who was being rejected or deported from the U.S. was welcome to come to Canada. So the origin of that fake news and those rumors was the Prime Minister himself, who made it very unclear as to what Canada's immigration policies were. So I think that's something that we should keep an eye on, this Jerusalem Post story. Again, the Canadian government claims, Canadian officials claim it's totally untrue, but I do wonder where the origin of that story is and what is being said in closed doors, in those peace talks over there. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. Again, if you like the video, don't forget to share it, like the page, and go check out True North. The website is tnc.news. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Bye.